Pensions can be a turn-off. But wait, they could be really fun and exciting. OK, maybe not. But they are important. Keep watching. We're all going to retire one day, and our pension helps determine the quality of life we will have when we do. For public sector workers, in 2015 the government changed the way their pensions are calculated. If you work in the public sector, you might expect it to affect everyone in the same way, whatever your job or qualifications. You'd be wrong. If you compare the occupational pensions of this generation of public sector workers with what their parents and grandparents would have got, some people will get about the same. A few will be better off, but some are going to be a lot worse off. To understand why, we need to rewind to the 1890s, the first time that government employees had the right to a pension. At that time, life expectancy at birth was 44 years. In the 1960s, it had risen to 71. Today, it is 81 years and it's still rising. If more people are claiming pensions for longer, there are three options. We all work longer. We all have to contribute more while we're working, which means lower take-home pay. Or our pension payouts aren't going to be as generous. Most private sector pensions are what's called defined contribution. You pay an amount that you decide each month. And it goes into a pension fund with the contributions made by everyone else, like filling up a bathtub. The fund is invested in the stock market. When you retire, you take a pension that depends on how much you put in and how successful the investments have been. Most public sector pensions are defined benefit instead. How much you get is calculated based on how many years you worked. It's these rules that have changed for a typical public sector worker, like a teacher or a nurse. To see this, imagine you went to work in the public sector in 1962 and earned a little more each year for 40 years. When you retired in 2002, your pension would have been 40/80ths, that's half of what's called your final salary. The new rules mean that if you did the same job today, your pension will now be based on your average salary instead. But you would get a bigger chunk of that average salary. Instead of 40/80ths, it will typically be in 60ths. So the pension, if you start work in 2015, will look like this. Adding these yearly 60ths together gives the career average pension, CARE. For most people who start work in the public sector today, that pension pot will be a bit smaller. Overall, you might think this seems fair, but is it? There are some surprising winners and losers. To see this, first, public sector pensions are unfunded. A public sector pension doesn't come from a pool of savings. The money to pay today's pensioners comes from today's workers. So today's employees are working to pay a pension for people who have already stopped working. The pension they are paying for looks like this. But the pension they will get looks like this. Do feel free to share this video with your parents, by the way. Second, it matters whether you are a high flyer or not. What if your salary over time looks more like this? Maybe because you have fewer qualifications or just don't get promoted. Then the new rules might actually make you better off. If you have a valuable skill or are good at your job, then your salary over time will probably look more like this. You may be a lot worse off when you retire than you would have been. This may make it harder to keep the best qualified people in the public sector. Many public sector workers choose their job with lower pay than they would have got in the private sector because of the pension benefits. Care schemes can reduce the attractiveness of these jobs in terms of total reward, especially for the high flyers. Finally, it matters which job you do. Let's compare someone who retired in 2002 to someone who just started work in 2015, and let's imagine that they do the same job. If neither went to university and work in the civil service, on average, the pension of today's workers is worth 25% more. If you're a graduate and you work in the civil service or are a teacher, you would be between 3% and 5% worse off. But if you're in the police or the fire service, it doesn't matter what your level of education is, your pension pot has shrunk by 40%. Under the old scheme, for an average person, the nurse's pension was around £175,000 and the police pension was worth over £400,000. If you work as a nurse, the value of your pension is more than £10,000 bigger than it would have been. At the far end of the scale, a police officer has lost out by close to £170,000. Why has this happened? Well, something had to change. But the new system may make it harder to recruit the best people to the public sector. And those just beginning to work today may be a lot worse off than their parents and grandparents when they retire. But they will be the ones paying for their parents' pensions. Do most people know these things? They probably turned off at the beginning. So, if you've watched this far, thank you, and please share.